Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shane. I'm from Microsoft Services. I'm an architect with Microsoft Services, and I've been specialising the last few years in data warehousing and business intelligence. And about 6 months ago, one of our premier support customers got in contact with me, and they were in a situation that I think is probably familiar to a lot of you, which is that they had a particular report that they really needed. So there was some urgency to it, and this report required them to get data from a lot of different places inside the organisation. So this data wasn't inside a data warehouse or anything like that, so there was some complexity around that. They had to pull data from different places. And the people inside the organisation that would be able to do that for them usually couldn't meet the timeframes that were required for the business. So I've seen this certainly a lot of times. I would imagine this is quite a familiar situation for you. So it just so happened that this was about 2 or 3 months, I think, before Excel, something like that, before Excel 2010 was to be released. And there's a new capability inside Excel 2010 called PowerPivot. And I felt that PowerPivot might be just the thing that they needed, basically, to do this for themselves, to pull this report together themselves. So I went to the customer and we worked through this issue using PowerPivot. It was pretty interesting in those early days with the early version, pre-release version of, I think it was in CTP at the time. But still, it went really, really well. The project went well. And so that's what we're going to show you today. We're going to show you from end to end. We're going to build in front of you the PowerPivot solution that we did. It's pretty close to exactly what we did. We've tidied up some of the data, so we are not really dealing with the data quality issues, I guess. But other than that, it's pretty much exactly what we built. We've also changed some of the data in order for privacy reasons. So the organisation that contacted us was the Department of Internal Affairs, and the person specifically was Michelle from DIA. And I'd like to welcome Michelle and thank you very much for coming to TechEd and presenting with me. So I'd like to now turn over to Michelle, who's just going to talk to you a little bit about specifically what the business issue was that DIA were trying to solve.
Cool, thank you. So in DIA, I'm the manager for their desktop services, and we have around 2,000 desktops in the areas that I deal with. And I was asked to tell the business how many PCs does each business group have. Relatively simple question. They want to know what they're paying for and who's using them. It's something that every organisation kind of wants to know. Being a desktop team, we know about desktops. We had management tools in place. For us, it's System Center Configuration Manager. And it had a whole bunch of data about PCs, more than I knew what to do with, really. But I couldn't actually put that in the context of people easily. And so what my senior management team really wanted to see was something that looked a little like this. By business group, how many PCs am I using? And they would like to see that over the months, so every month they'd like an updated count so they knew where they were tracking right now. When I spoke to Microsoft, I knew that the data existed somewhere in my organisation, but I didn't quite know how to put it all together. And my level of Excel knowledge is relatively good. I use Excel for budgets and I check out things like that and I can put reports together, but I didn't know how to bring multiple data sources together and make something as dynamic as you can with PowerPivot.
Oh, come on, Michelle, VLOOKUP.
Yes, I could have gone VLOOKUP, Shane. That was a viable solution in the time frame I had. Okay, so that's where I want to get to, and that's where we will get to today. So what I want to do is just show you what a pivot table looks like in Excel. So we'll just swap over. Yeah. One more.
The mouse.
No, one more, I think. One more. Excellent. And here's Excel 2010. So we're just going to go out. We're going to go out to the intranet and bring in some PC information. And what we want to do is just find out if you put that PC information to a pivot table, what is it that you can get out of that pivot table? So over to data, and we'll go from web. Now we've got this over here. This is our intranet page for today, and we have some login information for each computer. And what we're doing with our management tool is we're taking a snapshot of the PC at the time. It goes out and collects a snapshot, one per month for this report. And when it takes a snapshot of the PC, amongst all the PC information like specs, software installed, it gives me a login. If there's a user logged in at the time, it will record that user information. And that's what you're seeing around here. What we do with this report is we don't just have 1 month's data there, it just keeps appending every month on there. So you can see that we have data for about 5 months for today. So I'm going to grab that URL and just come back into Excel. And
Go.
thank you, Shane. Awesome. So here we go. We've got some our login information, and we'll drag this out. And today we're just going to select this table here and click Import. Into the existing worksheet is fine. Cool. So we've got our data, and nothing too special. Let's go and grab a pivot table. So it selects my data range automatically, and I'll put it into a new worksheet for this. So I'm not sure who's familiar with a pivot table, but when you're working with a pivot table, you have the columns, which you saw, are now fields that we can use. And down the bottom, we can put them into rows, or we can make them into values, or use a filter. So what we're going to do is make username the rows. So now I'm seeing a list of all the different usernames. And I want to do a count of all the computers those usernames logged into. And this is giving me a count for all of the 5 months, which is okay, but I'm going to do a filter by month. So when I do a filter by month, it puts up the month up here above the table. I'm just going to choose it for, say, December last year. And so as a desktop services manager, what I'm starting to see in this information is that most people are logging on to just one computer. So probably they're people that come into the office and just do day-to-day stuff. And in this list somewhere, there will be somebody who's logging into three different computers in that month. And we've got 4. These are people where either they're part of my desktop team and they've been logging in at the PC and fixing faults at the time that the snapshot was taken, or if they're not one of my desktop team, are they actually more mobile and need a laptop, or do they have a laptop and a desktop? So I can ask some questions about their use of technology in the organisation just by putting this into a pivot table and doing some thinking about what I can see. But that's as far as I got, right? I didn't get to my actual question, which was how many PCs are each of my business groups actually using? And I can't go any further. This is as much as a pivot table can do for me right now. So, clicky thing. I think I'm still here. Yeah. Cool. So this is when I started to think about what data sources do I have available to me in the organisation. The people who know about people in my organisation are HR, obviously, and finance have some responsibility codes. So if I could get, so SCCM PC data gave me username and computer name, and the username matched with the network login in my HR system. Thankfully, the HR system also had the responsibility code, so we're starting to get down to budget information. But the responsibility code then had to be assigned to a business group, so I had the overall view. And I got that by going to the finance system where they had responsibility code and business group. So you can see that the 3 data sources together are starting to tell the entire story. And this is where we get into PowerPivot. So what we'll do now is we're going to open up the PowerPivot window and start to work in the PowerPivot environment. And it's actually separate to the Excel environment. So let's have a quick look. If we go over to the PowerPivot tab, and what I'm going to say here is that PowerPivot is not in Excel 2010 natively. It is a download that you can install to get that. Shane is going to talk more about PowerPivot and how it works with Excel, and we'll do that later in the piece. Right now, we're just going to show you what you can start to do in PowerPivot and how it looks like, so that when we do talk about it, it makes a bit more sense. So, I have here my list of data, and I need to format it as a table before I take it there. So,
It's your pivot table, Michelle.
Thank you very much. I've done that before. I'm going to get rid of it so I don't do it again. Okay, now we're in the data. Okay, so I'm going to format this as a table, pretty blue. And what I'm getting here is it's telling me that if I format it as a table, I'm going to lose my connection to the external data, and that's fine. Cool. Over to PowerPivot. And we're going to create a linked table, and when we do this, PowerPivot environment will start up as well. And this is it, bringing it into the PowerPivot environment. Back in Excel, it had row numbers and it has column labels. In PowerPivot, you're starting to get more of a database look and feel. So we have sheets or tables, and the columns are they're the columns, but you don't get row numbers. And Shane will talk more about that later. So now that we're in here, I'm just going to rename table to logins. And we're going to go and grab the data from the HR system. And that's from a database. Let's look up the database. And there goes our TechEd data. And I'm just going to select a list of tables. Here I could just hit finish and then we'd bring all the data in as is without previewing. It's quite useful to just take a look at what you're actually working with. And so I've got 3 columns here and only 2 of them are really useful for me, so I can start to do my data cleanup right now. I don't need the middle column at all. And we've got our costing code column. A couple of things here is if you only wanted to work with a subset of the data, you could get rid of a bunch of your values here. You could choose one, right-click, filter, and select filter by that cell value. Another way is the drop-down box, and you could control-click multiple values of what you want to see. It just means that as you're bringing data in, you don't have to get rid of that stuff later. You can do it right now. Let's just clear that row filter and click OK. And finish. There we go. So now we've got our payroll sheet. So we've got the payroll table is now here. And all we need to do is create the relationship between the username and the network login. So to do that, it's just into the design and create relationship. Logins, username. And we're going to do the same for payroll and look up the column network login and click create. So there's nothing that you visually see here, but if we go back into Excel, what we can do is come into the PowerPivot tab still and choose pivot table into a new worksheet. And if you see up here on the right hand side, what you're getting is both the logins sheet and your payroll sheet. And now you can start to work with this data across those 2 data sources. So I'm going to choose to go by costing code and the row label and computer. So we're getting a count of computers in each costing code and the values. And then we're going to put month into slices. And I'm also going to put month into column labels. Cool. So what you're seeing here now is costing code relates to some budget information, and for every budget there's a budget holder. So I can now tell the budget holders that, hey, your group used 17 PCs or 10 PCs. And then they're going to tell me, okay, that's cool, but who? And what's on those PCs? So I've started to get a little bit of the information in there and more of a story. What I can also do with a slicer that's a little bit different from a pivot table in Excel is you can just select one month to look at. You could select a couple at a time, and you can do some comparisons. And slicers are really dynamic, very easy, and really useful, which we'll see later on. So that's the start of our story happening. Let's go and next step. Yeah. Thank you. Cool. Hand over to Shane.
All right. So just sort of thinking about what's just happened there, we have taken 2 completely different data sources in 2 completely different places. One was in SQL Server and the other one was on the intranet. We've taken a linking column between those 2 and we've linked those data sets together, and then inside Excel we're able to then do a pivot table that falls across those 2 different data sets. And that, it seems easy, but that's hard today inside Excel. And the only way really to do it is with sort of something like a VLOOKUP or something like that. So that is I guess one of the issues here is sometimes this looks a little bit easy. So as you're watching it, have a little bit of a think about how difficult that would be without PowerPivot. Actually, what we might show first before we do that is bring in the next data source.
For sure.
Yeah, bring the data source.
So the next data source is the finance information. And what we want to do there, let's go back into PowerPivot. Cool. So the finance information, remember we've gotten to the point where we've got costing code and username, but now we need to get from costing code somehow to business group. So we're going to go into the Home tab, and The finance information people gave me an output from the finance systems in a .csv file format. So we'll go from text, and let's go grab the file path. I need to close that. Cool.
Wow, you've gone into Visual Studio now, Michelle.
Well, you know, I'm branching out.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So here we are. We're going to tick the use first column, first row as column headers. And there goes our responsibility code and our business group. If you remember back, our costing code looks a bit different to that. Let's just bring it in and then we'll figure out what to do. Cool. So if we go back into payroll, you can see that the costing code is actually 11 digits long and the responsibility code is 8 digits. In DIA, our costing code is made up of our responsibility code and then 3 digits of an activity code. And those 3 digits aren't actually relevant to me. And somehow I have to make these 2 columns be able to relate to each other, and they've got to match. What you can do here is a calculated column, and we'll break out so that Shane can explain more about that before we come back and do that calculated column.
Okay, so how many of you are familiar with doing just functions, general functions inside Excel? So a lot of you, and we're used to doing that. We've done that for a number of years. And the good news is that when we do calculations or expressions inside PowerPivot, they look almost exactly the same as doing one inside Excel. And in fact, most of the functions that we're used to inside Excel work, they're exactly the same functions when you're working inside PowerPivot. So that's really good news. The big difference is, however, that when we're in Excel, we have, as Michelle said, we had rows which are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and columns 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we refer to different cells, we do that with the cross-reference, A1, A5. But as you saw in PowerPivot, we don't have cells in the same way we have in Excel. Instead, we have column headers and columns. So the functions are exactly the same. They look exactly the same and work pretty much exactly the same, except that we refer to column names instead of cells. So you can see here in this first example, it's first name, and then we're concatenating on a space, and then last name. And so this would give us like a full name. So in this case, when you put in a calculated column, this will act on every single row inside that table. So you can only, that's another big difference, is that in Excel, you can put a different formula for every single row, whereas in PowerPivot, you put one formula for a column, and that automatically applies to all of the rows inside that table. When you create a calculated column, it really is essentially just adding another column to that table. So once you've done the calculated column, you can use that column just like any other. There's no limitations, I guess is what I'm saying. You can use that column just like it's any other column. If you refresh the data, update the data, that calculated column will just automatically recalculate. You can do aggregations just in the same way you can do aggregations inside Excel, things like sum and average, etc. Except if you do an aggregation and then supply a column name, that aggregation will give you the aggregation for every single row inside that table. So, for example, if we go sum of the sales amount, that's the sales table amount column, it will be the total of every single sales amount value in that table. Of course, you can apply filters to that to only sum it up for certain subset of that table, but we'll go into that later.
Cool.
So now, with that in mind, the other thing I was going to say is that we call this DAX, so data analysis expressions. The reason I'm telling you that is that helps you look this up on the internet if you want to find out any more information.
So let's hop back into PowerPivot and let's go and do a calculated column to sort out that difference between the costing code and the responsibility code. So we're going to use the left function, and the left function will return the first however many characters I tell it to return from where I choose from. So we're going to choose the first 8 digits. Any cell will do within the column we're working with. And we want to do equals left, open bracket, select the right column, and comma 8, Cool. So now we have something that looks a lot like the responsibility code over here. And what we're going to do is come back, and in our calculated column, which I'm going to change to responsibility code, because I'm a human and I like human names, we're going to create that relationship and link the last of the data in. So payroll and responsibility code from the finance information. So we should be able to go back into Excel at this point. And as you can see, that PowerPivot has said the data's been modified, so let's refresh. And here comes our third sheet that we can start to choose options from. And I'm just going to remove months so we can look at this a bit cleaner. If I drag out costing code, which wasn't always that useful, and instead put in business group, we now have count of PCs by business group. And if we put the month back in to column labels, let's drag this over so we've got a bit more room. What we now have is exactly what my management team wanted. I have a count of PCs by business group for every month. As you can see down this side, it's got a grand total, which isn't useful. I'm going to right-click on that table, come into pivot table options, totals and filters, and just remove that grand total so it cleans it up a bit. This is exactly the information I needed, and it's been really easy to get there. And I can make this ready for a report by coming into Insert, choosing a chart, and there we go. So we're pretty much, we've got what we needed from our model. And there's probably a lot more that we can do now that we've set up all those different relationships. But I'm going to hand over to Shane, and he's going to talk more about what happens in PowerPivot and how Excel works with it.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, so I feel like having sort of a minute's silence here for VLOOKUP. So let's just talk a little bit about how it all works. I think this is helpful to understand how it's working under the covers. I certainly have found that helpful as I've been using PowerPivot in understanding kind of what's going on. So how many of you are familiar with analysis services in SQL Server? Okay, well, quite a lot of you. So for those of you that aren't familiar, analysis services is a feature or a capability of SQL Server, and it enables you to create cubes, and these cubes can be connected to from Excel. Effectively, the cube allows you to put the data in a format whereby you can connect to it from front ends like Excel and do pivot table type kind of analysis. And what is happening actually under the covers with PowerPivot, there is actually two different applications really happening here. We've got Excel that we know and love, but also there's PowerPivot. And as you saw with, you may not have really noticed, but Michelle was actually switching really between two different windows. They're kind of connected, and the data can kind of be connected between the two, but they're really two different windows. When she was in Excel and then she'd go into that tab and click on PowerPivot, it would switch over to the PowerPivot environment. It's inside PowerPivot that you can pull in or import information from a number of different data sources, and you can link them together, and you can create these calculated columns as well, and use those to do the linkages, etc. What's happening under the covers is there's actually an in-memory version of analysis services running on your laptop or on your workstation. It's a special in-memory version of analysis services because it has a different calculation engine in it. If you're interested, it's called VertiPack. So it's a new type of calculation or storage engine which has been added into analysis services, and it has the ability to run in memory on your workstation. It's a very powerful storage engine, and one of the differences between it and the one that's traditionally analysis services is that you don't have to go through the task of processing that data. So for those of you that are familiar with analysis services, you'll know you bring the data in, and then you have to process that data before you can use it, and you have to wait for it to process. With the VertiPack engine, that's not required. You just put the data in it, and away you go. It's very efficient. So I've seen some demonstrations of 100 million rows in some of these tables on a workstation with 4 gigabytes of RAM. So depending on the data, I'm not necessarily suggesting you do 100 million rows. I imagine that was a little bit of a trick, but that'll give you a good indication that we're not talking about very small data sets like like we're looking at here. You can use very large data sets, and it'll be very efficient. So What's happening under the covers there is PowerPivot is creating this in-memory analysis services cube. And then when you switch across to Excel and create a pivot table, you're connecting to that in-memory cube, and Excel's just acting like it usually does in browsing an analysis services cube. So as Michelle said, if you just open up Excel 2010, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to look for the tab. It's not going to be there. All you need to do is go to www.powerpivot.com and download the add-in. It's free. You don't have to pay any more for it. Just download it and install it. Incidentally, PowerPivot.com is the best place to go for resources for PowerPivot. It's a fantastic website. It has a lot of help articles. It also has a number of video presentations showing you how to use it. In addition to that, it also has hands-on labs. So you can go there and you can say, I want to do a PowerPivot hands-on lab. It'll actually fire you up a virtual PC over in Redmond somewhere, I assume, that you can connect to, and it'll allow you just to bring you up a virtual machine that you can run a whole end-to-end hands-on lab for PowerPivot. So that's the place to go after this if you want to learn some more. So now I'm going to hand back over to Michelle, who's going to talk a little bit about where she can take this now. She's answered her initial question, which is the number of PCs for each business group, but where can we take it now?
Yeah, so it was great that I answered my management team's question, and it was really useful for them to see how many PCs they were using each month, that kind of thing. But I also know that back in my management tool, I have a lot of information about PCs, such as what software they have installed, so Project Visio, that kind of thing. Also, make, manufacturer, IP address, RAM, all of that stuff that you would generally find about a PC. And we can collect that out of the management tool very easily. And if I can start to relate it down to things like people and business group with PowerPivot, I'm probably going to get a lot of really useful information that helps me in my role too. Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to come into PowerPivot, and let's switch over. And we are going to bring in the computer data. And I've got this as a text file. Over here. Cool. So again, just tick that box and we start to get something a bit more meaningful. And as you can see, computer name, manufacturer. So this is stuff about the desktops that you would see at DIA currently. The RAM it's got, processor, and Visio project. I'll bring that in and close that one out. So we've got our computer name, and that's the thing that we can tie back into our logins to get all of this information relating together. So I'm going to come over here, and we are going to create that relationship now. So we've got logins and computer, and we're going to choose the computers table and the computer name from that table. Cool. Let's go back into Excel. Refresh the data once more. And I'm actually just going to grab the manufacturer and put that down in slices, thank you. And we'll also grab model. Actually, I'm just going to push this out. I need this down one. Good. All right. So if we push this window over a bit and get a bit more room, what we're going to do is have a look at all the HP PCs. They're our main PC brand that we use. And I want to understand how many PCs do I need to replace in this financial year. So now I'm starting to think about managing my work fleet and our life cycle. And I know that the D530s are getting on a little bit. So how many of those do I have? And should think about replacing in this financial year. So control key, and I'm just going to multiple select all the different types of D530. That's them. So I can see that actually, you know, as of April this year, there are 123 D530s sitting in my organisation. If anybody else who's in desktop, you kind of know that when you are trying to figure out how to replace your work fleet and keep them current, this kind of information is really useful. It tells you a couple of things. For me, it tells me that there are a bunch of people out there who are probably, they've got some slow computing going on, and if I haven't heard about them, I'm sure that some managers within the organisation have been hearing about how slow those desktops are. So I can start to replace those. I can make my customers' life just that little bit better by being proactive when I replace their PCs. The cool thing that happens here is that on the slices part, when I choose Hewlett-Packard, it actually grays out all the rest of them, and it makes the models available for the Hewlett-Packard. And it's really easy to just change what we're looking at. So we can also look at Toshiba's and come back up and start to choose a different model that we want to look at. So I could do that for Project or Visio, or actually any bit of information I could drag out of our management tool. And it is really powerful in terms of being able to dynamically understand what's happening in my work fleet. And it wasn't something that I actually expected to get out of PowerPivot when I spoke with Microsoft. What I want to do is hand back to Shane, and we will talk a bit more about calculations, and this time about calculated columns and measures.
Great. So there's actually two different types of calculations inside PowerPivot. And it's really important to understand that there are two different types. When I first started using PowerPivot, I didn't understand this, and I got a bit confused about why when I created a calculated column and a calculation in one place or the other, they worked quite differently. So you need to understand there are both calculated columns, and there are also things called calculated measures. So a calculated column is something you've seen already and reasonably simple to understand. You basically create a calculation, and that gives you a new column inside your table. A calculated measure is actually created in the Excel environment, and it's created when you're creating a pivot table. So what the difference is with a calculated measure is that the calculation happens on the fly for every single cell inside your pivot table, and it's dependent on the context of that cell. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, we just need to understand context a little bit. So imagine this is a pivot table. It's a pretty simple pivot table. We've got the regions on the rows, and we've got the years on the columns. So if we think about, firstly, the intersection between 2008 and the North Island, just think about that we're in the context of North Island in 2008. So any calculation that you do will only run in the context of North Island 2008 when it will dynamically run in that context, and whatever calculation comes out of running inside that context will appear inside that cell. We also have what we call the all context. So what I mean by that, if we look at your top right-hand corner where it says all year, we are still in the context of the North Island, but we're in the all context of years. So your calculation in that case will dynamically run and populate that cell for North Island for all years. And that's the same for all regions, but for a particular year. But if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see we have the all context. And that means that for any grand total down in the bottom right-hand corner, it's going to run in the context of everything. So what we can actually do, as well as that, is we can change the context on the fly. So I'm going to show you one of these in a moment, which will help make it all come a little bit clearer. But so there's various functions that you can use to change the context on the fly. So I was saying with a calculated measure, that measure runs in whatever the context is of the cell that it's running in. Sometimes we don't want that. Sometimes we want to change that context for whatever reason. One of the functions that we can use is the filter function. That filter function takes the current context and applies an additional filter to it to take that down to a smaller subset. So it only will work in the context of the current context plus only anything that meets a certain criteria that you say. And we're going to do exactly one of those in a sec. The other one is the all function, and that says, say we say the all for the year column. That means ignore what the current year context is, jump out to the all context. Why is that useful, you might say? It's quite useful for when you want to understand the ratio that a particular value is inside a column to everything. For example, you might want to know the ratio of a particular amount of sales for a year against all years. So the only other thing you need to know at this point is that there is another function called calculate, which you can use to change that context. So what you can do is you can say equals, calculate, opening bracket, a particular calculation, comma, and then one of the change context functions. So let's see how we can use this. And I'm only going to very much scratch the surface of what you can do with calculated measures. For those of you that are used to using, where have I ended up?
Move the mouse.
For those of you used to using analysis services, calculated measures are the same as calculated measures inside analysis services. In fact, that's what's happening. You're adding a calculated measure into that in-memory analysis services queue. So what I'm going to do firstly is I'm just going to create a new pivot table, and the reason why I'm doing this is that I'm going to just want to show you about something that's happening inside the data so that you can understand why it's calculating in a particular way. So I'm going to add in a new pivot table, and I'm going to filter down to a particular computer, 1243. So I'm going to drop that in the filter and just find 1243. So what I'm actually doing right now, if you think about it, is I'm changing the context. I'm changing the context to say any calculations only work in the context of this one computer. I'm also going to drag month down to the columns. So I'm going to see information for every month, the usernames on the rows, and I'm just going to do a count. So now what I want you to see here is for this particular computer, this person has logged in for the last 3 months, but prior to that, the blank person has logged in for 2 months. What this actually means, it's just knowing what's going on in the data. In the data, when a blank person has logged onto a computer, that means the computer was on the network, but nobody was logged onto it. So when the system came and checked that computer, found it on the network, but nobody was logging on. So it looks like this computer was basically there dormant for those 2 months. So the formula that we're going to do, the calculate measure we're going to do, is we're going to try and create some calculations which are going to tell us about computers which are not being used. And possibly we may find some computers on the network which aren't being really used at all, or seemingly so we can go and do an investigation and find out if we can remove them from the network and save licensing fees, etc., and maintenance fees. So let's create a calculated measure. So here, I right-clicked on here and I'm going to go Add New Measure. And this is, if I do it here, I'm not creating a calculated column, I'm creating a calculated measure. So what I'm going to do just to start with is I'm going to count the rows of the logins table. And I'm going to call this, months logged in. Right. So while I'm counting the rows of the logins table, remember that this is only going to calculate for each cell in the pivot table in the particular context of that cell. So it's not going to count all the rows in the logins table. Just to make this a little clearer, I'll drag off month, drag off username, and drag off that. And we can now see, because I'm in the context of this one computer, this computer has been on the network 5 times, for 5 months. And that's what we expected. I'm now going to add another measure. And I'm going to use the measure that I just created, but I'm going to change that measure's context to only tell me the months that were logged in where the username was not blank. So I'm going to use the calculate function, and I want to use my logins months logged in measure that I just created, and I'm going to change its context using the filter function. So filter function, the first thing the filter function expects is the table you're going to filter, which is the logins table. And then it expects this filter. So I want to find where there not is blank logins username. So basically what I'm saying is use my months logged in calculation, but only for the months where there was someone logged in, where the username wasn't blank. This is quite useful, the check formula. It gives you, you click it a lot because it gives you positive feedback, hopefully. It says no errors in formula, so I feel good about myself. And then we go, OK. Oh, and I didn't give it a name. So this is going to be months logged in. Check the formula again, still all right. Here we go. Oh, no, months Well, that's what I called my first one. That was meant to be months on network, so I've mucked that up. So that's the months on the network. And this one, I just need to change this here to months on network. I just thought I'd do this to make it even more confusing. Okay. Okay, so this is, the first one was counting the months that was on the network, and now I'm counting the months that they were logged in. And I know that because the ones they were logged in is where the username wasn't blank. Cool. So we can now see the months on the network were 5, and the months that people were logged in is 3. And now I'm just going to create a ratio between those two. So this equals the logins. It'll be the months logged in divided by the logins months on the network. And this is % logged in. And there we go. We can see 60% of the time this particular computer, people were logged in on the network. I will format that as a percentage. We'll get rid of these two. We don't really need them now. Drag off set computer to all. And then I'll drag the computer down to the row labels. Now if I sort, so now I'm seeing it for all the computers. Now you'll see that my formula is calculated in the context of each individual computer now. So while I've written one formula, it's running lots of different times, one for each computer that I've sliced down to. If I then sort that from A to Z, you'll see we don't have any 0%. Now I know that there are some 0%, and the reason for that is that when a value is blank, it doesn't show. So I wanted to show you that and also show you how to sort that out. There's a little trick you can use. If something's blank and you add 0 to it, it becomes 0. So I'm going to add 0 to the end. Here we go. And now if I sort it A to Z, I see here that there's some computers for which no one was logged onto the network, and these are candidates that we can possibly for saving some money. And this is something you actually did, isn't it?
Yeah, we did. We had a look to see which computer accounts weren't actually being used, and then we went and asked, hey, what's happening with this computer? It's allocated to you, we think. What are you doing with that? And those PCs may just be computers that aren't used very much, so they might be a spare PC sitting in the contact centre, which need to be there and available just in case. Or they actually might be, oh yeah, that's just sitting there, we don't really have anybody at the moment. And it's like, well, let me have that back, I'll put it back into our stock, and I can always give you a new PC when you have somebody come on board. And we were able to save some money towards the end of the day.
So, we've been talking about the client version of PowerPivot, but there's an equally important server story for PowerPivot, and I think it's extremely important. I don't know how many of you are thinking, oh great, so we're going to have lots of people inside my organization creating PowerPivots, emailing them to each other. This is going to be a little bit of a disaster. So that's why there is, and it's like that with all these kind of tools, isn't it? We need to understand how it's best to use them. And that is why in the PowerPivot world, there is an equally important server story. So the server story for PowerPivot is in SharePoint. 2010, you do need the enterprise client license. So with the enterprise client license for SharePoint, that is the server story. What happens is you can create a report just like we have inside this presentation, and then Michelle could publish that report. Instead of emailing it around to her friends, she can publish that report up to the intranet inside SharePoint 2010. That means that the report can be secured and it can also be managed. And it doesn't also, of course, just fly around the organization. You've only got one copy of it for people to use. In addition to that, people can then view that report just using their browser. They don't need Excel 2010 on their client machine. They just access it via their browser. All of the filters and the slices still work. So if you think about the one we've created, it had all those nice slices down the left-hand side. You can still interact with those slices using your browser, and the reports and charts, etc., will all change. Also, for the IT management can have a look at all of the PowerPivot spreadsheets running inside SharePoint, and they can see which ones are being used the most. So, I mean, I am a data warehousing architect, and I'm interested in to understand what this kind of means for me. And the reason why I'm excited about PowerPivot is because I think it redefines the relationship between someone like Michelle and someone like me. Wouldn't it be great to be able to go to Michelle now, to be able to look on the intranet and see that this particular report is one that's being used a lot, it's very popular, so that I can then go to Michelle and say, okay, we've seen that this is a very popular report. How can we as the IT department work with you to take this out of a spreadsheet and move this data into the data warehouse so that, and get some proper testing on it, etc. I'm able to then get the benefit of all the work that Michelle's gone into and understanding the data sources and understanding all of the different measures and the value that she's going to get out of it. It completely changes our relationship and the conversations that people like me and people like her can have. So I think that's very, very important, and why the server story for PowerPivot is extremely important. That it basically redefines the relationship between IT and the users. Because at the moment, what's actually happening is we've got people like Michelle sitting there unable to get this report that she actually needs. So unless we provide a tool like PowerPivot, we're actually just basically getting in the way of what is important business.
So the conclusion from my experience with working with Microsoft at Department of Internal Affairs is that by providing this information out to the business groups about the PCs they were using and their count of project and Visio, it actually changed their behaviour. They reduced the number of PCs they used, they reduced their project and Visio count, and only used it where they really needed it. And it meant that we went to a lot of effort to get our desktop counts being accurate, so that we knew that when we came to true-up time, where we are reporting on accurate data. And what I noticed in the last financial year is that we did not increase our desktop count and we did not increase our project count. We had 10 extra Visio licenses. And it was a massive difference to what we had experienced in previous years. And it meant no extra cost to the business in terms of their Microsoft licensing. The other things it means for me is if I don't have inactive PCs sitting on the network, it's a lower security risk, and there's a whole lot of really good things that are happening just by making some information available. And we had all of that data there already. We just didn't know how to put it together into something meaningful, which is the story of PowerPivot. And we did save a lot of money out of it.
Great. So now just talking about some related content here. There is another session if you want to go into more detail with PowerPivot. That's on tomorrow. Also, another thing that I think would be very relevant, because we've talked about the server story for business intelligence from Microsoft, is to go to the session on understanding where you can take SharePoint as far as the business intelligence stack with Microsoft is concerned. You also wanted to mention the third one. Yeah,
so the BNZ group have been doing some really cool work with PowerPivot and Microsoft as well. And Cesar is presenting on Wednesday, and I really recommend going to see what the BNZ are doing. It's really interesting and exciting. And probably the only other thing to mention is it will be at the Recharge Bar for 15 or 20 minutes after the session if you have any questions. And are there survey sheets this year?
I'm sure there must be survey sheets.
Fill those out. That'd be great.
And I can't, powerpivot.com, make sure you don't forget that. But we've actually, I think we've got...
Have we got some time?
We've got 10 minutes for questions now, if anybody wants to ask some questions.
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I forgot that. It was one of my points, but I forgot to mention it. When you publish your Excel workbook up to SharePoint, you can create a schedule for all of the data sources, and they will automatically refresh. So the ones that are capable of refreshing. So, for example, if you created a link to a SQL Server database, then once you publish it to SharePoint, you can say every night at 3 a.m., refresh yourself, so that anyone who goes there will get the latest data.
Does that work with SharePoint data services? So from PowerPivot, using maybe a SharePoint list source?
I'm just trying to think if SharePoint lists are one of the data sources. I think they are one of the data sources in PowerPivot, aren't they? Yeah. So that would work with SharePoint lists. So we only showed you a few of the data sources that you can connect to. There's some interesting other data sources. One is reporting services 2008 R2. One of the augmentations in the R2 version of reporting services is that it can act as a data source for PowerPivot. So you could publish reports using R2 and then connect to those reports and bring them into PowerPivot, and then if you publish them to SharePoint, as the report refreshes, your PowerPivot in SharePoint will refresh. You can also connect to any other ODBC database, Oracle, lots and lots of different data sources. It will work with a CSV. So it will work with. So I guess what you need to bear in mind there is that you're pointing it to you want to point it to a UNC path, which is the SharePoint has access to. So as long as you do that, then that's fine. It will refresh all the text file data sources. Yep. Yep. Sorry? Connect a what, sorry? Oh, an assembly. I'm not aware. So the question was, I should have been saying the question, I'm sorry. The question was, can you connect an assembly into it? I'm not aware that you can connect an assembly into it. Yeah. I mean, so the VertiPack engine that I was talking about in analysis services, it actually sits inside analysis services. It's actually there inside the R2 version of analysis services. What they haven't exposed yet is the ability for you to create a cube, a VertiPack cube, with anything other than Excel. So I guess it's watch this space there as far as that's concerned. But I think that's quite exciting. But currently I think the reason why is that there are some limitations in the VertiPack engine. You can't do many-to-many joins and things like that you can do in analysis services, which I guess is part of your question. It is a subset of the capability of analysis services, but as you can see, it's got all of the key stuff in it at the moment. But I would imagine that's going to get more advanced as time goes on.
One to our right.
Yeah.
Can you create PowerPivot dashboards on analysis services cubes?
Can you create PowerPivot on analysis? Well, you can connect to Excel, from Excel to a cube, just like you can today. So we sort of haven't taken that functionality away. So you can.
It was the
The
slices.
slices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you could connect your PowerPivot to your own
Yeah.
analysis services cubes, it's almost as you mentioned with slices. It's quite a powerful little point and click.
Yeah, I agree with the slices, and I was disappointed myself to go and see that when I connected to a cube from analysis services, the slices didn't appear. You can connect to analysis services from PowerPivot, but of course that's kind of a different relationship. You're pulling data from analysis services, and that would be common. For example, there's probably some key dimensions in your analysis services cubes that you want to bring into PowerPivot to connect to. Yeah. Yes. Can you effectively do a drill down like you can from an analysis services cube and drill down to the detailed data? Is that the question? Down to the SQL server or the data underneath the covers? Yeah. So there isn't the drill through capability in there, but I mean, those of you that aren't familiar with analysis services itself, this is like a great start for an end user tool to be able to create their own analysis services cubes in Excel. Don't forget that analysis services is very much there, and there's a lot more fantastic capability inside analysis services. So any of these sorts of things, this is for people like Michelle to use, but you still want to be creating your analysis services cubes, and there's a whole lot of capability, like for example, being able to go to an aggregation, right-click, take an action, drill down to the underlying data across to reports. Lots of neat stuff in analysis services. So if you like this, go to your data warehouse team and say, why don't you think about putting some cubes over the top of your data warehouse data, because then you can get great pivoting from Excel. Anything else? Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And get out and PowerPivot. Thank you.